In the quiet suburbs of Aurora, Colorado, a tragedy unfolded that shocked the community and raised difficult questions about self-defense, vigilantism, and the deadly consequences of paranoia. This is the story of Orest Schur, a former U.S. Space Force analyst whose decision to take the law into his own hands left a teenager dead, another child critically injured, and a family destroyed. And it's the story of how one night of fear turned into a 54-year prison sentence. But the night that changed everything. It was October 2023, just after midnight. Schur and his wife were home when she thought she heard someone tampering with her car parked outside. Aurora, like many suburban neighborhoods, had seen a rise in car thefts and break-ins. For many residents, the constant threat of crime created a simmering tension. People felt they had to protect themselves because they didn't believe the system would. Schur, 49 years old at the time, grabbed his firearm and went outside to investigate. What he saw were two young teenagers, 14-year-old boy and his 13-year-old friend, near his wife's vehicle. What happened next was fast, violent, and irreversible. Instead of calling the police, instead of shouting a warning, instead of de-escalating, Schur opened fire. One boy was struck multiple times and died at the scene. The other, just 13 years old, was critically wounded but survived. Two kids who should have been in school, who should have been playing video games or sports, were instead caught in the sights of a man who thought he was delivering justice. He was an educated man, a former analyst for the United States Space Force trained to think strategically. He lived in a middle-class neighborhood. He wasn't facing a home invasion. He wasn't being physically attacked. This wasn't a split-second life-or-death struggle. But prosecutors argued that Schur acted out of rage, not fear. They said he chose to execute rather than protect. Called 911, he could have shouted or fired a warning shot. Instead, he aimed directly at children. Eyed the trial. When Schur went to trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, and community activists. The victim's family sobbed as prosecutors described how a 14-year-old boy lost his life in what should have been a non-violent property crime at worst. The defense tried to frame Schur's actions as self-defense, arguing that in the middle of the night he had no way of knowing the teen's intentions. Maybe they were armed, maybe they planned to carjack, maybe they posed a real threat. But there was a problem. They weren't armed. They weren't inside his house. They weren't charging him. They were kids near a parked vehicle. And under Colorado law, the Make My Day statute, the law that allows homeowners to use deadly force against intruders inside their homes, didn't apply. The jury didn't take long to decide. Schur was convicted of second-degree murder, attempted murder, and assault. The judge handed down a 54-year prison sentence. And the fallout in the aftermath, the community was divided. Some argued Schur was a victim of fear, a man who snapped under pressure from rising crime. Others saw him as a reckless vigilante who turned a minor situation into a tragedy. What couldn't be ignored were the facts. A 14-year-old boy was dead. A 13-year-old survived but will carry the trauma for life. And a man who once had a career in the military space program will now grow old behind bars. Even the police chief weighed in, saying, "We understand people want to protect their property, but when you pull the trigger, you better be sure your life is in danger." This was not that. Bigger questions. The Aurora case forces us to ask hard questions about fear and responsibility. Where is the line between defending yourself and becoming the aggressor? At what point does standing your ground turn into murder? And when society fails to protect us from crime, does that justify taking justice into our own hands? For Orest Schur, those questions aren't hypothetical. They cost him his freedom. A wife thought someone was stealing her car. A husband thought he was the protector. But in the end, a teenager lost his life, another barely survived, and a man who believed he was stopping crime is now branded a murderer. This is Appeal Denied, where we tell the stories of those who thought they were delivering justice but wound up facing it themselves.